My background in Torah is a mixture of academic and rabbinic. I was a shul rabbi for many years, and I was a member of the Beth Din of America for 20 years. And it's hard to separate one's academic background from one's religious background. There's another part of my background that I'm going to try to separate, but it's just worth disclosing. I have a son who served in the Israeli army for many years. He was a platoon commander, and I've had many conversations with him about his experiences in the army. And I have two children who live in Israel to this day. But I'm going to try to separate um, uh, the analytic components of what I want to say from the reality of the world we're living in right now. I am going to review the five great views found in the 20th century on war law in Halakhah, and apply it to humanitarian law in some realistic way. Um, I'm not going to touch on events of the last 110 days in any direct way, mostly because one's perception of factual reality hugely impacts this. Frequently, one can't discuss humanitarian law in the middle of a crisis. One has to look back at it after the facts are well established and the reality has been played out. And then you can play alternative history if that's a game that actually interests you. It doesn't interest me very much, but I know it interests other people very much. In grand outline, there are five great views found among Jewish law authorities of the 20th century about what I will call war law. And these five great views really are extremely different and very broad. And I guess I want to start with the most extreme view. The most extreme view is the view of the late great Satmar Rebbe, Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum, who maintained that the correct way to understand the three oaths mentioned in the Talmud is to prohibit the establishment of a Jewish army and a Jewish nation and a Jewish state. And he intuits from this that not only is sovereignty prohibited, but defending the Jewish people is essentially prohibited. The rabbis demanded, as part of the surrender with Rome, that the Jewish people throw themselves on the mercy of the world around them and rely on non-Jews to protect us. He's very clear and honest that he thinks that the institution of an Israeli army and Jewish sovereignty is a violation of Jewish law. That the pact we made with the Romans was that we would not engage in self-defense and they would defend us. Suffice it to note that the current pathway of Halakhah and the current pathway of Jewish destiny has rejected this view, but nonetheless, it's out there. There's no denying that it has some intellectual current in the Jewish tradition. And he elaborately defends it in his written works called Al Ha'Geul of Al Tamura. And he explicitly lays it out as not just his approach, but the approach of a significant segment of what we would identify as the Hasidic community in America. It still is a common view among the Hasidic community in America, which is the institution of a Jewish military, no matter how it conducts itself, no matter what rules it follows, violates a rabbinic decree against Jewish sovereignty. It's out there. The second view, one step removed from that, is the view of Rav Elazar Menachem Shach, the great leader of the Panovich Yeshiva in Bnei Brak, who maintained that one step to the left of this. There is no unique rules for war. War is just the rules of pursuer writ big. and that military conduct is just, in Hebrew, hilchot rodef, with many rodfim and many nirdafim, many pursuers and many victims, and sometimes pursuers become victims and victims become pursuers. But the rules of war are just the rules of group pursuit and group victimhood. What flows from this, Rabbi Shach writes, is that there's never a license to kill an innocent civilian ever in wartime. And the rules of war are no different than the rules of a police action. And thus, for example, a policeman who's being shot at by a criminal and who can only defend himself by shooting through an innocent civilian is prohibited from doing so in a police setting. And thus, Rabbi Shachentuitz is prohibited from doing in a military setting as well. Unlike the Satmar Rebbe, who labels the establishment of the State of Israel and its military activity as inherently illicit, Rabbi Shach maintains nothing like that. He maintains that Israel is duty-bound to defend itself with what we would call an elaborate police force. But just like the police are never authorized to kill innocent civilians, the military is never authorized to kill innocent civilians. End of conversation. Now, I could add to this conversation, by the way, that even Rabbi Shach might adopt the view of the Chazon Ish. The Chazon Ish famously writes, and there's some family connection between Rav Shach and the Chazon Ish, and also, I think Rabbi Shach would view himself as deferential to the Chazon Ish, that even in situations of pursuer, the Chazon Ish maintains that you are allowed to kill innocent civilians in the course of saving yourself, so long as your intent is not to kill them, your intent is just to save yourself. The Chazon Ish famously notes a World War I question involving a hand grenade being thrown into a trench. He doesn't word it that way. He discusses bows and arrows because he likes to pretend he's living in the 1400s when he's actually living in the 1950s, because that's intellectually worthwhile. That you can deflect bows and arrows to protect yourself, even when you know that others will die from these deflected bows and arrows, since your essential intent is to save yourself. Could be that Rabbi Shach accepts that that too is correct, and that a military can engage in defensive activity that kills innocent civilians. I think both of these views are not normative within the mainstream of Jewish law. I articulate them because they are two of the five camps that are out there, but I don't think either one of them is anywhere thought of as normative, or maybe it's only thought of as normative by people who don't serve in the military. As they famously note, if you don't serve in the military, it's easy to be strict on all of these questions because there's no cost of being strict. Maybe that's the cynic in me. I try very hard not to be cynical. The third view is the famous view of Rabbi Goren, who was the chief rabbi of the Israeli Defense Forces for many years. Rabbi Goren maintains that the rules for an Israeli army are found in the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, in Hilchot Malachim Milchamoteim, and he writes an elaborate commentary on these rules to explain how to apply Maimonides' rules from nearly a millennia ago to the 20th century. And a second elaboration of this code is done by Rabbi Yehuda Gershuni, of great fame of a certain era around a contemporary of Rabbi Goren. Many years ago, I sat and met with Rabbi Gershuni to discuss his work with him, and he was insistent to me very directly that he and Rabbi Goren were prepared to deal with all of the realities of running a military consistent with the Rambam's code. If you read Rabbi Goren's work and Rabbi Gershuni's work, there is no doubt that they attempt to do so from the dilemmas of friendly fire. The idea that what should you do when you are accidentally attacked by your own forces, to countless other dilemmas associated with running a military. Both Rabbi Gershuni and Rabbi Goren write an elaborate code designed to work in the real world, grounded on the Rambam's Mishnah Torah and its application in the 20th century. Against this view strides Rabbi Shaul Yisraeli, a great Jewish law authority, a contemporary of Rabbi Goren and a contemporary of Rabbi Gershuni, who is insistent that Rabbi Shach's view is ridiculous. The Satmar Rebbe's view is worse than ridiculous. He calls it retarded, which is not a polite word, but nonetheless, he thinks it's patently ridiculous to abandon so many Jews living in the Holy Land. He thinks it's an anathema and repugnant. And Rabbi Goren and Rabbi Gershuni's view, which he thinks is sweet and interesting, but ultimately wrong. And he doesn't think it doesn't work. He thinks it's not the dominant view of a majority of the Rishonim and the Achronim. And Rabbi Shaul Yisraeli advocates a very different view, which is extremely relevant in our time. Rabbi Yisraeli first articulated his view in response to the Kibbulah massacre by General Sharon, who was then not a general but a major, and he articulated it many times throughout his lifetime. He maintains as follows: there is no Jewish law of war, and that the Ashkenazi Rishonim, led by Tosfot, and a straight-out majority of Rishonim affirmatively reject the Rambam's codification of the rules of kings and their wars, and maintain that there is no law of war other than treaty law. And Rabbi Yisraeli is insistent that Israel, by which he means the state of Israel, is not bound in fighting wars by any rules other than the rules of war that Israel and its neighbors agreed to by treaty. And there is no native Jewish law of war. Just like you can kill in war, and killing is a very, very, very serious violation of Jewish law. It's the number one violation. And not only can you kill, it's clear he maintains from dominant sources found in the Rishonim, you can kill innocent civilians as needed in wartime. If you can kill innocent civilians as needed in wartime, and you can sometimes even order the death of your own soldiers in wartime when that is a military necessity, you can do anything else that's needed to win the war, because war entails the wholesale suspension of law. War is the wholesale suspension of law, with but one exception. Treaty law resides above this. And in one of the delicious ironies of life, he delves deeply into the Rambam's rule of treaty war to demonstrate that the only thing that resides above the general suspension of war in law is the idea that when nations go to war, they sign agreements with each other which define how the war will be fought. So Israel has signed various conventions with its neighbors. Rabbi Gershuni writes, Rabbi Israeli writes, and those treaties that Israel has written with its neighbors define how Israel will conduct its war. And he says, thus, vis-a-vis Egypt, both Egypt and Israel are signatories to the Geneva Convention, and thus the various Geneva Conventions govern wars with Egypt. Syria is not a signatory to most of the Geneva Conventions, and thus the Geneva Convention does not govern wars with Syria. And in the Kibbulah massacre, Rabbi Israeli maintains that since we are not fighting with a state actor at all, but with terrorists who are resident in Jordan and not the Jordanian government, there are no rules of war. And that if they sneak into Israel and kill our civilians, Rabbi Israeli maintains, you know what we can do? We, the government of Israel, sneak into their camps and kill their civilians. He doesn't necessarily maintain that this is wise or prudent or a good strategy or a bad strategy. He maintains in a very frontal way that humanitarian law and war law are like copyright law, which is they're both a construct of international law, and they're both essentially governed by treaty law. And the very nature of treaty law is it is bilateral. And Rabbi Israeli adopts the view that's currently the rule the United States government takes as well. In the famous case of Hamidani versus Bush, President Bush, that is, the United States government took the view that once the government of Afghanistan surrendered, the Taliban fighters who continued to fight in Afghanistan were not prisoners of war. The Geneva Convention did not govern them, and they had no legal rights at all because treaty law is bilateral. And once they are no longer soldiers of the Afghanistani government, because the government of Afghanistan has surrendered, they are simply criminals, and international law does not govern the treatment of criminals or terrorists. It only governs the treatment of nations at war. That view is first intuited by Rabbi Israeli in the 1950s. It's not intuited first by the Solicitor General of the United States in the year 2000. It's first intuited by Rabbi Israeli, who says the nature of treaty war is war by contract. You and I agree that while we can shoot at each other, we will not use chemical weapons. How come? It doesn't matter why. We've agreed no chemical weapons, but yes, bullets. You ask me, do I really care if I die from chemical weapons or bullets? I might say, I don't care, but we signed an agreement which said we will not use chemical weapons, and thus Jewish law precludes a government from signing a treaty and then violating the treaty. And Rabbi Israeli intuits that both the status of humanitarian law and the status of its close cousin war law are totally and completely governed by treaty law and not governed by native halakhah. Excuse me if I put it in its most straightforward way. This is a case where dina de malchuta dina governs the rule here, except it's not dina de malchuta, it's dina de brit dina. The rules of the treaties are the rules, and since Israeli law incorporates treaty law as native Israeli law does, American law does not, by the way, but Israeli law does. If Israel signs a treaty, it is the law of Israel. Rabbi Yisraeli maintains that treaty law is governing on Israel because Israel agreed to it. And when treaty law does not apply, Jewish law does not require it. And I'm going to say something interesting and intuitive about the spectrum of normative Jewish law in the late 20th and early 21st century. Over the last 50 years, Rabbi Shaul Yisraeli's view has become the dominant view among normative Jewish law authorities. Most Jewish law authorities have abandoned Rabbi Goren and Rabbi Gershuni's view, and they do not attempt to discern native Jewish law principles from Halakhah. They defer to international law as incorporated into Israeli law. If you want to see an example of this, I'll prove it to you sort of analytically, sociologically. There's a famous handbook they hand every Dati soldier when he joins the army called Hatzava Kehilchata. The army, according to Jewish law, it's a famous handbook in the same manner of Shmirat Shabbat Kehilchata or Yom Tov Kehilchata, Hatzava Kehilchata. And it has 35 chapters in its most recent edition, and it deals with every aspect of the army according to Jewish law, except for fighting a war. It doesn't at all deal with who should a soldier kill and whether he should follow orders. It deals with such things as, is the food kosher? How to handle matters of sexuality in the army, what to do on Shabbat. Should I feed my army dogs chametz on Pesach? Or if I stop feeding them chametz on Pesach, they won't do such a good job sniffing out bombs, because an army dog that's designed to sniff out bombs, who has an upset stomach, burps a lot, and then he doesn't smell too well. So maybe I should feed him chametz on Pesach. It deals with all sorts of ritual matters of halacha, from Pesach to Shabbat to kashrut to financial matters. If a soldier lends you money and Rachmana litzlan, the soldier is killed, who should I collect from? All sorts of technical matters of halacha. But when you ask in this book, where's the chapter on obeying military orders and who should I kill in the military, the book is silent. It does not have a single chapter on how to fight a war according to halacha. The central component of Hatzava Kehilchata, which is military law as it applies, Jewish law as it applies to the central activity of the military, is left out, because the book says up front that when given a lawful order, you are supposed to carry out your lawful orders in a military setting, even though we all know that military orders sometimes given to pilots or tankists or soldiers produce death of innocent civilians. But this book, the classical book of how to conduct yourself according to halacha in the army, assumes that Rabbi Shaul Yisraeli is absolutely, totally, and completely correct. No ifs, no ands, and no buts about it. And what about Rabbi Goren and Rabbi Gershuni and their whole school of thought from the 40s and 50s and 60s that we can run an army according to the Rambam's Mishnah Torah? I think when all said and done, Rabbi Yisraeli showed that that model of halacha was never fully accepted, even though it is without a doubt the Rambam's model. Rabbi Yisraeli advances three counter arguments to Rabbi Goren. The first is, he says, that even the Rambam's view was messianic, and the Rambam never intended it to apply to the modern Jewish pre-messianic state. Let the record reflect the fact that the current state of Israel is pre-messianic. And thus, even the Rambam thought his rules didn't apply. And on top of that, even if the Rambam might have thought his rules applied to the modern state, the overwhelming majority of Rishonim reject that view of the Rambam, led by Ravid and Tosfot. They intuit that in a pre-messianic universe, there are no rules governing Jewish sovereign areas. And that is distinctly the view of the majority of Rishonim. And thirdly, Rabbi Yisraeli says many of Rabbi Goren's insights into the Rambam are, how shall I put this, sweetly far-fetched. And it's extremely difficult to actually understand Rabbi Goren's read of Maimonides as correct. He's more deferential to Rabbi Gershuni's work because Rabbi Gershuni sort of tries very hard to live in the real world. Everybody who knew Rabbi Yehuda Gershuni knew that he was very, very, very deeply committed to living in the real world, and he provided real world guidance in these situations. Grounded in that fact, Rabbi Yisraeli's view dominates, and Rabbi Ovadia Yosef and Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, two great Jewish law authorities who were contemporaries and lived later than Rabbi Yisraeli, casually and in passing, without any exact discussion of this issue, make note of the fact that it's obvious that Rabbi Yisraeli is correct and the other views are incorrect. I don't think Rabbi Feinstein even read the views of Rabbi Yisraeli or Rabbi Goren or Rabbi Gershuni before he simply waves off the discussion and intuits that the laws of war are developed in accordance with the law of the land rather than in accordance with Jewish law. He has a letter to an American soldier who served in a bombing mission in which countless civilians were killed. And the man is a Kohen. And he wants to know if he can continue to duchen, since he undoubtedly killed many people, and our practice is that Kohanim who kill innocent people don't duchen. And Rabbi Feinstein says if you operated in accordance with the rules of war as given you by the American government, everything you did was exactly proper with no problem, and you shouldn't spend a moment worrying about the innocent German civilians that you might have killed. This is exactly in line with Rabbi Yisraeli's view. I think if I could put Rabbi Feinstein on this Zoom call, which would truly be an indication that the Messianic era has actually arrived, I think Rabbi Feinstein in cross-examination would say he never read Rabbi Yisraeli's work, and he never read Rabbi Gershuni's work, and he probably confesses that he never read Rabbi Goren's work. It's well known that Rabbi Feinstein, in response to a letter from Rabbi Ephraim Greenblatt, where Rabbi Greenblatt says, don't you know you said something that contradicts the Mishnah Berurah? Rabbi Feinstein says, gee, that's interesting. I don't really learn Mishnah Berurah. So if he doesn't really learn Mishnah Berurah, he certainly doesn't really learn Rabbi Gershuni and Rabbi Goren and others like him. Rabbi Feinstein was iconoclastic in his commitment that he only read classics that were written before 1900. And if he's not prepared to learn the Mishnah Berurah, I just deep in my heart have my doubts that somebody handed him the most recent volume of Rabbi Yisraeli, and he put aside whatever Rishonim he was studying to closely read Rabbi Yisraeli. And Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, who certainly read all of the above, he read Rabbi Goren, and he read Rabbi Gershuni, and he read Rabbi Yisraeli, is wholehearted in his endorsement and his expansion of Rabbi Yisraeli's view. He thinks that Rabbi Yisraeli's view is not only true in Israel, but it's true everywhere all the time, and it's not uniquely about a Jewish state. So we end here with a summary. In the mid-20th century, there was a hot and heavy dispute between two groups of Jewish law authorities, Rabbi Shaul Yisraeli and his team, and Rabbi Goren and Rabbi Gershuni and their team, about whether Jewish law has indigenous rules of law governing war. I've implicitly discarded the view of the Satmar Rebbe because he's wrong, and I've implicitly discarded the view of Rabbi Shach because he's wrong too. And I've noted in this conversation that both humanitarian law and war law, which are opposite sides of the same coin, are essentially incorporated into Jewish law the exact same way copyright law is incorporated into Jewish law, which is through treaty law. And although copyright law and war law and humanitarian law have very little in common one with the other in terms of their substantive law, one deals with a financial matter and one deals with saving lives, nonetheless, Jewish law takes the same view to both of them, which is Tov shebiyefet ba'olei shem. The nicest thing about Jewish law is it effortlessly incorporates the best of foreign law into it by agreeing to foreign law by treaty. And that's exactly what Jewish law does in humanitarian law. We effortlessly incorporate the best of humanitarian law into Jewish law, and we effortlessly incorporate the best of war law into Jewish law through treaty law, and we fully and completely think it governs our views as we choose to agree to them through treaty law. Thank you very much, and I welcome questions and answers.